Hi there and welcome to the new Python video. Today we're going to talk about Argparse, which is the recommended command line parsing module in the Python standard library. So if you want to create friendly command line interfaces, this video is for you. I will split this video into two parts. In the first part of this tutorial, we'll talk about some basics. We'll see what positional and optional arguments are, how we can add them to our command line interface. And in the second part of this tutorial, we'll actually see how we can build a very simple network scanner using CLI. So without further ado, let's get down to it. I'm here in my terminal, and first of all, I want us to take a look at the simple concept of command line interfaces. I'm going to run the ls command, which gives us a listing of files in the current directory. But what if we wanted to see all the files in the current directory? We'd have to add an option to our utility. And in this particular case, it's -a option. This gives us a listing of all the files. And we call this an option because it's optional. We can use ls utility without specifying this option. So let's take a look at another example. What if we wanted to copy certain files or certain file to another location? On Linux systems, we can use cp command to do that. But if we run this without any arguments, you can see that we get usage hints. And this basically means that we need to provide positional arguments to our utility. Optional arguments are enclosed in square brackets, and we can see that here. But here we have these positional arguments that we need to provide in order for our utility to work. So let's see what I've got here. We have this Argparse tutorial.py file, so let's try to copy this to another location. I'm going to say tmp test.py. It worked just fine. So these are so-called positional arguments because we cannot use our utility without providing them. We have optional and positional arguments. We have as well something called parameters, and parameters provide us or our utility some additional information. So if we took a look again at the ls command, a parameter would be something like this. Basically, what we do here, we are providing additional information to our utility. So instead of listing files in the current directory, we'll list the files in the tmp directory. And that's exactly what we get. Okay, so now that we have basics behind us, let's actually go to our Spider IDE and let's see how we can create simple command line interfaces. So to do that, first of all, as always, we need to import a module. In our case, this is Argparse module. And the very first step to create a command line interface in Python using Argparse is to create a parser object. So I'm going to say parser equals, and from Argparse module, we're going to take argument parser class. And we are not going to provide any parameters or arguments here. We're going to leave it as it is for the time being. The second step to create command line interface in Python is to use a method called parseArgs on our parser object. What this method does basically, it collects the arguments that a user passes via the command line to our utility, and it lets Python know how to handle them, simply speaking. Okay, so I'm going to do that right now. parseArgs, this is the method, and so as I said, we parse the arguments that a user or we provide via the command line. So we can collect these arguments and save them to an object. So I'm going to say that we're going to store it in args variable. Alright, so I think we're ready to go. So I'm gonna go back to our terminal and let's see what we get when we run our very simple script. So first of all, I'm going to make sure that we are in the correct directory. There we are. And if we run python 3 argparse tutorial.py, this is the name of our script, we get nothing. That's expected because we have no print functions in our script whatsoever. But what happens? Let's see what happens if when we provide -h option. We get usage hints. And please pay attention to that fact here that we have optional arguments, and this is something that we get for free when we create parser object using Argparse. So we didn't have to explicitly define this help optional argument, we get it out of the box. Here we have the name of our program, and by default this is the name of the file, of the script file we're using. As you can see, we have -h in square brackets. It means basically that it's optional. We can go just fine without it. And here we have a short version, longer version, and the description of our optional argument. So now let's see how we can create or add optional and positional arguments to our utility. Okay, so I'm going to go back here, and after the definition of our parser, what we need to do is to use the method called addArgument. So I'm going to say parser addArgument, and first of all, we're going to add a positional argument. So since we will be creating a network scanner, we will need to provide a target network. So I'm going to call our first positional argument target. And a very important thing, if we provided dashes before our argument name, Argparse module would identify this as an optional argument. If we don't do that, it stays as a positional argument. It means that we'll have to provide this argument in order for our utility to work. Okay, so we have something called help keyword argument that we can pass into our addArgument method. So I'm going to add some description here, so a user, whenever he uses our utility, he knows what it does and what he needs to provide. Okay, so provide IPv4 network range. That should do fine. Okay, it looks like we have what we wanted. Let's now see how we can add an optional argument. And to do that, we are basically doing the same. We're calling again the addArgument method on our parser object, but this time, as I said, we need to prepend our argument with dashes. So I'm going to say -v. Let's add some functionality to our CLI. Let's assume that we will have an option to turn on verbose output in our tool. So here we have this short version of our optional argument. I will add a longer version as well, so I'm going to call it verbose. And here I'm going to add some help message as well, and this is going to be called turn on verbose mode. And when we define these optional arguments, we have another keyword argument. Actually, we have a lot of them, but we're not going to go through all of them because that's not the point. We can always look them up in the documentation, but I think these are the most useful that you need at the very beginning when you start learning Argparse. So this argument is called, keyword argument is called action, and it basically defines the action that should be triggered, or maybe in other words, it basically defines what should happen with the value passed on the command line as this optional argument. So it lets Python know what to do with this value, and by default it will just store it as it is as it is passed by the command line. But here, let's assume that we want to turn on verbose output if a user provides this -v option. So to do that, with Argparse, we can define an action called storedtrue. And basically what it means is that when a user provides -v option on the command line, it will store this value as true. In other case, it will be stored as false. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. Well, let's assume that we have some arguments passed on the command line. They are saved to our args object, our args variable, and we can access these attributes simply by calling these names, by accessing these attributes on our args object. So I'm going to say args, actually let's print this out, print args verbose, and we're going to print the target as well, args.target, and let's as well print args because I want you to know what happens when we parse these arguments. We get a namespace object that contains all the values passed via the command line to our utility. Okay, so let's now go back to our terminal, and I'm going to clear the screen first of all, and I'm going to say Python 3 argparse, and now I'm going to use this -h again. But see what happens, see what we get. We get positional argument right now, so we have our target, we have the description of our argument, and we have this verbose optional argument here as well. And as you can see here, our optional arguments are enclosed in brackets, and our positional arguments doesn't have it. All right, so let's provide this information to our utility and see what happens. Argparse, we need to provide our positional argument. So I'm going to say, we're going to provide a network range. That's what we'll be doing in the next video. And I'm going to turn on verbose output as well. So to turn on verbose output, we basically provide this -v option. And as you can see, that's what we wanted to print out. We get this namespace object, and that's the values. These are the values that are passed in via the command line. We get this true value because this has been provided, and we have our target. Let's see what happens if we don't provide -v. We get false. So, how you can use it? You could go back here, you could get rid of this, and you could say something, if args verbose, print turn on, or you could say verbose mode turned on. In other case, we can just say quiet mode. So that's how you can use these values. Let's go back. We have quiet mode right now because we didn't specify -v, but when we do this, we get verbose mode turned on. So that's how you can implement logic in your scripts later on. Okay, so let's take a look at some arguments, keyword arguments that we can add here to our object. So as I said, by default, the name of the program is derived from the name of our script file. So we can change this. But first of all, let's change description of our tool, and we're going to call it very simple network scanner. That's what we'll be doing in the next video. Okay, so let's now go back and run this again, or maybe let's print out the help information. So you can see that we get this info here. So you can provide more info, of course, and you can format this info as well, but we're not going to talk about it in this video. You can always look it up. We can add information at the end of our help message, and this is called epilogue. So let's say that What can we put here? Okay, super admin is watching. Be careful. Okay, let's go back here, and it looks like I made a mistake. Obviously, I didn't put a comma here. So let's go back. Let's go back here. And we have this epilogue information here as well. And we have another keyword argument called prog, and we're going to call it network scanner. And if we clear this and we run this again, you can see that after the usage and the colon, we get the name of our utility, basically. Okay, so let's go back, and I just want to quickly show you that we have different options to store these values. In this case, it was possible to store this verbose option as a true or false Boolean value, but what we can do here as well is simply define some choices for our users. So we can give choices to the user. So if we go back here and we run help, you can see that we have 3 choices that the user can make. So for example, we could apply this logic here if args verbose equals, and so on. 1, let's print something out, verbose mode, elif args verbose equals to this output, things like that. You get the point. We could continue with that. I'm not going to fill in the free option. We're just going to pass for the time being. That's not the point, but I want you to understand what we can do with that. Okay, if we go back here and we're going to provide our target again, because this is mandatory, and we're going to provide this optional argument. Let's see what happens. We provided the 2, but it didn't work because by default, when we pass these arguments by the command line, they are treated as strings. But in our case, we have a number. So we need to change the type of our object, and we can do that with the keyword argument called typed, and we just basically set it to integer. And if we clear this and rerun this, that's what we get. Alright, so I hope that you like this video. As I said, in the second part, we'll take a look, or we'll see how we can create a real network scanner that will use ARP protocol to discover hosts on the local Ethernet network. So if you're interested, I encourage you to watch the next video. Thank you for your time and take care. Bye bye.